There is a kind of problem that does not announce itself, it does not appear suddenly, it does not create immediate disruption, and because of that, it is often ignored. Not because it is small, but because it is quiet. It blends into daily life so seamlessly that most people assume it is normal, or unavoidable, or simply how things are now. But the most dangerous problems are rarely the loud ones. They are the ones that accumulate slowly, without resistance, without awareness, until they become part of the background. And that is exactly what this problem is, a background condition of modern life, one that affects focus, energy, decision-making, and even emotional stability. But it rarely gets named directly because it does not look like a crisis, it looks like everyday living. Let's begin by observing what life looks like for most people today. The day starts with a screen, before thought fully stabilizes. Before the body fully wakes, information is already being consumed, messages, notifications, updates, short bursts of content, and the brain responds immediately, not with reflection, but with reaction. This is the first shift. Attention is no longer internally directed, it is externally pulled, and that pull continues throughout the day. Work requires switching between tools, messages interrupt tasks, content fills every gap of silence, even rest is mediated through screens, videos, scrolling, background noise, and over time something subtle happens. The mind becomes less comfortable with stillness, not because stillness is gone, but because it feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity often gets avoided. So the brain fills space constantly, not out of necessity, but out of conditioning. Now, this is where the problem begins to take shape, because attention is not just a mental function, it is a resource, and like any resource, it can be fragmented, divided, overused, and depleted. When attention is fragmented, thinking becomes shallow, not because intelligence decreases, but because continuity is interrupted. Deep thought requires sustained focus, but sustained focus becomes harder when interruption becomes constant. And so the mind adapts, it shifts toward short-form thinking, quick responses, rapid switching, immediate feedback loops, and while this adaptation feels efficient, it comes at a cost, because depth is gradually replaced by speed. Now, let's expand this further. In earlier environments, attention had fewer competitors, tasks were linear, information flow was slower, and focus was easier to maintain for longer periods. But in modern environments, attention is constantly negotiated. Every second competes with something else. A message, a video, a notification, a thought triggered by external input. And this constant competition creates mental fatigue. Not physical fatigue, but cognitive fatigue. The kind that is harder to notice. It does not feel like exhaustion, it feels like distraction, or restlessness, or inability to fully engage with anything for too long. Now, here is where the problem becomes more complex, because people do not feel like they are overwhelmed, they feel like they are simply busy. But busyness and overload are not the same thing. Busyness is activity, overload is fragmentation, and fragmentation affects quality of attention, not quantity of tasks. Now, let's talk about decision-making, because attention directly influences decisions. When attention is fragmented, decisions become reactive, less reflective, more impulsive, because there is less space between stimulus and response. And that space is where thinking normally happens. Without that space, choices become automatic, and automation increases without awareness. Now, let's look at emotional impact. When the brain is constantly switching between inputs, emotional regulation becomes less stable, because emotional processing requires pause. But pause becomes rare, so emotions are experienced in shorter cycles, quick highs, quick lows, rapid shifts, and less processing time in between. This does not create extreme emotional states. Instead, it creates mild but persistent instability, a background sense of restlessness. Now let's talk about focus capacity. One of the most important but least discussed changes is this. People are not losing the ability to focus completely. They are losing the ability to sustain focus. Short bursts of attention remain intact, But extended focus becomes more difficult because the brain becomes trained for switching, not staying, and switching is easier than staying. So the brain chooses efficiency over depth. Now, let's connect this to productivity. Many people feel like they are constantly working, but at the end of the day, they feel like little was truly accomplished. This creates confusion because effort is present, but output feels fragmented, and this mismatch creates frustration. But the cause is not lack of effort, it is scattered attention. Now, let's examine why this problem is rarely discussed directly. Because it does not feel like a single issue, it feels like many small inconveniences, trouble focusing, feeling distracted, difficulty finishing tasks, mental fatigue, low motivation. But when these are combined, they form a pattern. Not separate problems, but one system-level issue. Now let's talk about environment design. Modern environments are not neutral, they are designed for engagement. Not rest, not focus, engagement. And engagement requires interruption. Because uninterrupted attention is less profitable in attention-driven systems, so the environment continuously encourages switching, even when the user is not actively seeking it. Now, let's bring in behavioral adaptation. Humans adapt to environments over time, so when interruption becomes constant, the brain adjusts expectations, it begins to anticipate interruption, and when anticipation becomes normal, focus becomes harder to sustain voluntarily because the brain no longer expects continuity. Now, let's talk about silence, not physical silence, but cognitive silence. Moments without input, without stimulation, without switching. These moments are becoming less frequent, and when they do occur, they often feel uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong, but because the brain is no longer used to them, and discomfort often leads to avoidance. So stimulation fills the gap again. Now, let's zoom out. What is actually happening here is not a breakdown. It is adaptation to a high-input environment. But adaptation does not always mean improvement. Sometimes it means trade-offs. And the trade-off here is depth, depth of attention, depth of thought, depth of emotional processing. Now let's talk about learning. Learning requires sustained attention because understanding builds over continuity. But when attention is fragmented, learning becomes surface level, information is absorbed, but not deeply integrated. So knowledge exists, but connection is weak. Now let's talk about relationships. Even interpersonal communication is affected because attention during conversations is divided, partial presence becomes normal, and partial presence reduces emotional connection, not dramatically, but subtly, over time. Now let's talk about rest. Rest is no longer just absence of work. It is often filled with stimulation, scrolling, watching, listening, consuming. So even rest becomes active input. And the brain rarely experiences true recovery states. Now, let's connect everything. The problem is not technology. The problem is not work. The problem is not modern life itself. The problem is continuous fragmentation of attention across all areas of living, work, rest, learning, communication, even thinking. And because it is distributed everywhere and it becomes hard to recognize as a single issue, but its effects are consistent, reduced depth, increased distraction, lower sustained focus, higher mental fatigue. Now, let's be clear. This is not about removing technology or rejecting modern systems. That is not realistic. The real issue is awareness, because once you see how attention is being used, you can begin to reclaim control over it, even in small ways, by creating space between inputs, by allowing moments of uninterrupted thought, by reducing unnecessary switching, by restoring continuity where possible. Because attention is not just a mental habit, it is the foundation of experience. Whatever you pay attention to becomes your lived reality. And if attention is constantly fragmented, experience becomes fragmented too. So the real problem is not just distraction, it is fragmentation of experience itself, and that is why it is rarely discussed clearly, because it does not feel like a single issue, it feels like life. But once you see the pattern, You cannot unsee it. And that awareness is the first step toward restoring depth, not by changing everything at once, but by noticing where attention goes and slowly bringing it back, because attention is not lost, it is just constantly redirected. And what can be redirected can also be reclaimed.